the first thing I smelled was lavender detergent on my cedar fence, and that was how I knew Brenda Whitlock had crossed the line again before I even stepped off my back porch. It was 6 in the morning on Maple Glen Lane, the air still cool enough to fog the edges of the kitchen window, and my coffee had barely stopped dripping when I opened the door and saw my entire north fence buried under someone else's wet laundry. White sheets sagged over the top rail like surrender flags. Bath towels hung from the pickets. A row of blouses dripped onto my vegetable bed, darkening the soil around my tomatoes and leaving clean, soapy streaks down the cedar boards I had sanded, sealed, and paid for with my own hands. The water made a steady ticking sound as it fell from the fabric to the mulch, and under it was that sharp chemical sweetness of detergent, fabric softener, and entitlement. I stood there in my work jeans and old cabinet shop hoodie, holding the blue carpenter pencil my father had given me when I was 17, the one I still use to mark cuts because it reminded me that a straight line only matters if people respect it. That fence was not decorative neighborhood scenery. It was 6 feet tall, 112 feet long, permitted by the county, built 2 inches inside my property line, and stained cedar all the way from the gate to the back corner where my workshop faced the alley. I built it after years of working late at my cabinet bench with neighbors walking past my windows, after I planted vegetables, after I wanted my yard to feel like mine instead of an extension of the homeowners association walking lane. Brenda lived on the other side, president of the Maple Glen Homeowners Association, owner of 3 matching patio umbrellas. For wind chimes she never heard from inside her house, and an opinion about every mailbox, shutter color, and trash bin on the block. For years, she had used my fence like her personal clothesline. Towels after pool days. Sheets every Monday. White shirts on hangers. Quilts after spring cleaning. At first, I asked nicely. Then I asked in writing. Then I sent photos. Then I repaired warped boards and mildew stains and sent receipts. Her answer never changed. It is just a fence, Ethan. That was what she said again that morning when she stepped onto her patio in a pale tracksuit, coffee cup in hand, looking at me like I had interrupted her routine instead of finding her laundry dripping across my property. Brenda, I said, keeping my voice even, take your things off my fence. She smiled over the rim of her mug. The side facing the lane is a community-facing feature. A wet sheet snapped softly in the breeze between us, slapping cedar like a hand against a table. Community-facing does not mean community-owned. She rolled her eyes. You cabinet men get so dramatic about wood. I looked at the blue pencil in my hand, then at the dark stains spreading down the boards, then at the small security camera under my workshop Eve blinking red in the morning light. What Brenda did not know was that I had stopped arguing weeks ago. I had started recording. Every towel, every sheet, every drip, every time she called my property shared because it was convenient for her. And that morning, as lavender water ran down my fence again, I finally understood something my father taught me years before. Sometimes the cleanest way to prove a line exists is to make sure the next person who crosses it leaves a mark. By the time Brenda finished her coffee, the morning sun had climbed high enough to turn every wet sheet on my fence into a glowing white wall, and the cedar underneath was already dark where the water had soaked in. I did not pull the laundry down. I did not toss it back over the fence. I did what I had learned to do after years of dealing with people who mistake patience for permission. I photographed everything before anyone could change the story. I took wide shots from my porch, close shots of the dripping towels, pictures of the water trails down the boards, pictures of the mud splashed onto my tomato leaves, and one clear video of Brenda standing on her patio saying, "It is not hurting anything." That sentence was almost funny, because wood remembers moisture better than people remember warnings. I had built that fence myself 4 years earlier after I bought the house on Maple Glen Lane, back when the backyard was just patchy grass, an old chain link line, and a workshop window facing straight into the neighborhood walking lane. I am a cabinet maker by trade, and when you work with wood for a living, you learn that damage does not always announce itself right away. Water sits, grain swells, finish breaks. Mildew starts in corners where people do not look until the stain is already part of the board. That was why I used Western red cedar, stainless screws, post caps, proper drainage spacing, and 2 coats of clear weatherproof sealer. I had the county fence permit in a folder. I had the material receipts. I had the survey showing the posts set 2 inches inside my line, so nobody could claim a shared structure. I had done it carefully because careful things last. Brenda never cared about careful. To her, the fence was convenient because it stood where she wanted a clothesline, and because she had spent too many years as president of the Maple Glen Homeowners Association, hearing herself say words like shared appearance and community standard. She liked phrases that made private things sound negotiable. She had called my fence a community-facing boundary feature in 3 emails, 2 violation letters, and 1 meeting where she told neighbors I was being difficult about neighborly use. Neighborly use. That was what she called wet towels sagging over my boards every Saturday. That was what she called removing the little brass tag I hung near the gate that said private fence. That was what she called letting soapy water drip into my garden and then acting wounded when I mentioned repairs. My younger sister Molly had been the one who told me to stop trying to win the argument in real time. Ethan, she said after the 4th time Brenda ignored a written request, make a timeline. People like her hate timelines because timelines do not care about tone. So I made one. Date, time, weather, what she hung, how long it stayed, what boards were wet, what email I sent, what response came back. Molly helped me save every camera clip to a cloud folder and print monthly summaries. The pattern looked ridiculous once it was organized. Sheets on Monday, towels on Wednesday, blankets after rain, white blouses clipped over the same 3 posts until the top rail began showing a faint gray bloom beneath the finish. That morning, after Brenda finally collected the laundry with dramatic sighs and muttered that some people had no sense of community, I walked the fence line with my blue carpenter pencil tucked behind my ear and marked every damaged board with a tiny X only I could see. My father used to mark bad cuts that way before replacing them. Not because the mark fixed anything, but because it told the truth before memory softened it. Then I opened my workshop cabinet, pulled out the folder labeled fence, and placed the newest photos on top. Brenda thought this was about laundry. It was not. It was about how many times a person can be told no before the law has to hear it. The next letter from the Maple Glen Homeowners Association arrived 2 days later, folded into a cream envelope with Brenda's signature printed at the bottom like a stamp of ownership. I found it in my mailbox after work, still wearing sawdust on my sleeves, my hands smelling like walnut, glue, and the lemon oil I use on finished cabinets before delivery. The letter said my repeated hostility towards shared boundary use had created unnecessary tension along the community walking lane. It also said the fence visible from the lane must remain visually accessible and neighbor-friendly. Visually accessible, neighbor-friendly. Those were Brenda's favorite kinds of phrases, soft enough to sound harmless and vague enough to hide a hand reaching over the line. I stood in my driveway reading it while her wind chimes clattered across the fence, and one of her white towels flapped over the top rail like punctuation. She had mailed me a warning about interfering with the very trespass she was still committing. That was when I called Molly and told her it was time to stop treating this like a neighbor dispute. She came over that evening with a laptop, a portable scanner, 2 folders, and the expression she gets when someone underestimates paperwork. We sat at my workshop bench under the long fluorescent light, while my table saw sat quiet behind us, and the cedar fence glowed through the back window in the last orange edge of sunset. I opened the fence folder and spread everything across the bench. The county permit, the final inspection card, the survey showing the fence 2 inches inside my parcel, the material receipts from Miller Lumber, the invoices for sealer, replacement boards, and mildew treatment. Then the photos started. Wet sheets in April, towels in May, blankets in June, shirts dripping onto tomatoes in July, Brenda removing the private fence tag in August, and a camera clip from September where she told Mrs. Evelyn Moore that the fence belonged to community standards, not to Ethan's little workshop kingdom. Molly paused the video and looked at me. She said that on camera? The camera under the eave caught it. Good. That is not casual use. That is claimed authority. She typed those words into the timeline, and they looked heavier on the screen than they had sounded in the air. By 9 that night, we had 43 separate incidents organized by date, time, weather, item, damage, warning sent, and response received. 43 times Brenda had turned wet laundry into a property argument. 43 times she had counted on the problem being too small for any one official to care about. But small things become expensive when they happen long enough. My cedar boards were starting to cup along the top rail. The finish had cloudy patches where fabric stayed wet for hours. The garden soil along the fence smelled faintly soapy after laundry days. I ran my thumb over one board where the grain had lifted, and I could feel the difference between weather and neglect. My father's blue carpenter pencil sat on the bench beside the folder, worn flat on one side from years in tool belts and shirt pockets. He used to say wood tells the truth if you know how to read it. That night, the fence was telling a simple story. Somebody kept using it after being told to stop. The next morning, I called County Code Officer Glenn Harris and asked for a fence location review. I expected a waiting list, but Glenn knew Maple Glen. Everybody in County Code knew neighborhoods where homeowners associations wrote letters like laws and then acted surprised when real law showed up. He arrived Thursday afternoon in a white county truck, walked the property line with my survey, checked the permit number, measured the post placement, and looked at the laundry marks on the boards. Brenda came outside halfway through, arms crossed, sunglasses pushed into her hair. "This is ridiculous," she said. "It is a fence facing a common lane." Glenn looked at the survey, then at the posts, then at her towel basket waiting on the patio. "Ma'am, this fence is on Mr. Caldwell's property." Brenda smiled tightly. "But it affects the community appearance." Glenn folded the survey back into its sleeve. "Appearance is not ownership." I wrote that sentence down the moment he left, because I knew I was going to need it later. The sentence stayed in my head all weekend. Appearance is not ownership. I wrote it on a yellow sticky note and pressed it to the inside of my workshop cabinet, right above the shelf where I kept my father's blue carpenter pencil. Every time I reached for clamps, hinges, finish rags, or a sanding block, there it was, simple enough to fit on a note and strong enough to knock the shine off every letter Brenda had mailed me. On Monday morning, County Code Officer Glenn Harris emailed his written finding. The fence was permitted. The fence was properly placed. The fence was not listed as a shared element, common structure, or homeowners association facility. I printed 3 copies before my coffee finished brewing. One went into the fence folder. One went to Molly. One went to attorney Laura Price, who had handled a boundary dispute for a customer of mine the year before and had the kind of voice that made unreasonable people discover calendars and deadlines. Laura called me that afternoon while I was fitting maple drawer fronts in the shop, and I put her on speaker so I could keep my hands steady on the clamps. "You have enough for a formal notice," she said. "Not a dramatic one. A clean one. No contact with the fence, no hanging objects, no removing signs, no claiming association access, and reimbursement for documented maintenance damage." I looked through the back window at the cedar. Boards glowing in the afternoon sun, still marked with tiny blue X marks where moisture had raised the grain. "Send it to her and the board," I said. "She is the board," Laura replied. "That is exactly why everyone gets a copy." The letter went out that evening by certified mail and email. Molly helped me attach the timeline, Glenn's finding, selected photos, repair receipts, and 3 short camera clips. Brenda hanging towels after my written request, Brenda removing the private fence tag, and Brenda telling Mrs. Evelyn Moore the fence belonged to community standards. The next morning, Brenda did not hang laundry. For the first time in months, my fence stood bare through sunrise, and the vegetable bed dried out under clean air. I almost let myself believe the letter had worked. Then at noon, a new Maple Glen email arrived with the subject Community Harmony along shared sight lines. Brenda had sent it to half the lane. She never named me, but she wrote about one resident attempting to privatize a community-facing improvement and weaponize technicalities against neighborly use. At the bottom, she reminded everyone that Maple Glen values cooperation over hostility. I read it twice in the workshop, sawdust drifting in the sunlight around me, and felt something colder than anger settle into place. People like Brenda did not stop when corrected. They changed the room around the correction. That evening, Mrs. Evelyn Moore knocked on my front door with a lemon cake wrapped in foil and an embarrassed look on her face. She was 76, lived 3 houses down, and had seen more Maple Glen presidents come and go than anyone. "I thought you should know," she said. "Brenda told people you were planning to stain the fence some ugly color to punish the neighborhood." I looked toward the back of the house where the cedar line stood quiet under the porch lights. "I have not told her what I am doing." Evelyn smiled a little. "Then maybe she is more worried than she sounds." After she left, I went into the workshop, opened the maintenance drawer, and pulled out the color samples I had ordered 2 weeks earlier. Blue-gray exterior would stain, county compliant. weatherproof, allowed under every rule that applied to my parcel, and strong enough to seal cedar against water that should never have been there. I laid the sample next to my father's blue carpenter pencil. The match was close enough to feel like a decision he would understand. The next 2 days became the quietest part of the whole fight, and quiet is when careful work gets done. On Tuesday morning, Laura Price sent Brenda and the Maple Glen board a second notice, shorter than the first and impossible to twist. It stated that I would be performing scheduled maintenance on my private cedar fence using an exterior blue-gray weatherproof with stain approved for residential fencing, that the fence was not to be touched, used, covered, leaned on, or altered during the process, and that posted wet stain signs were to remain in place until the surface had fully cured. She copied Glenn Harris from County Code, Molly, the property management company, and every board member except Brenda's shadow accounts, because Molly had discovered Brenda liked sending herself copies from different committee emails when she wanted a paper trail to look bigger than it was. I printed the notice and taped one copy inside my workshop window facing the fence. I mailed another certified. Then I walked the entire 112 feet of cedar with my phone recording, narrating each board, each post, each area damaged by moisture, and each place where the finish had clouded from wet fabric. The fence was empty. The weather was clear. My cameras were working. My blue carpenter pencil was tucked behind my ear, and the color sample sat in my shirt pocket like a promise I had measured twice. Brenda watched from her patio while pretending not to. She wore white gardening gloves and held pruning shears she never used, standing beside an empty laundry basket, as if routine itself had been interrupted. "You are making a spectacle," she called over the fence. "I am maintaining my property," I said. "That is not a crime. People will hate that color." I looked at the cedar, at the scars where her laundry had left the wood damp and uneven, then at the blue-gray sample in my hand. People do not have to hang towels on it. She turned away, but not before glancing at the camera under the eave. That glance told me she understood more than she admitted. The next morning, I started before sunrise. I set orange cones along my side of the fence, tied soft caution tape between garden stakes, and posted signs every 8 feet. Fresh fence stain. Do not touch. Private property. I filmed each sign. I filmed the unopened stain cans, the product label, the weather forecast, the clean rollers, the drop cloths over my tomato bed, and the empty top rail. I was not building a trap. I was building a record. When I opened the first can, the smell rose clean and sharp: oil, pigment, cedar dust, and that faint mineral note good exterior stain carries before it settles into wood. The color was not bright blue like a cartoon. It was blue-gray, deep and calm, the shade of storm clouds over slate, dark enough to cover the old watermarks and honest enough to look intentional. The first brush stroke sank into the cedar with a soft rasping sound. By the third board, the fence already looked stronger. By the 20th, the backyard changed. The tomatoes looked greener against it. The workshop windows reflected a cooler light. My father's pencil sat on the workbench where I could see it through the open door, the same worn blue against the same family rule: mark the line, then respect it. Molly arrived with coffee and a second camera. She stood near the gate and filmed me working in slow sections: top rail, pickets, posts, each stroke even, every warning sign visible. "She is home," Molly said quietly. "I know. She is watching." Good. By noon, the entire fence was stained and marked wet. I took final video from every angle. No laundry, no contact, no one near it but me. The blue-gray boards gleamed under the sun, still damp, still curing, still protected by signs Brenda had been told in writing not to remove. I washed my brushes, closed the cans, and placed the receipt, product sheet, photos, and video file into the folder. For the first time in years, my fence looked like mine again. And across the line, Brenda's empty laundry basket sat waiting on her patio like a bad habit trying to decide whether proof mattered. The mistake happened at 6:23 the next morning, and the camera caught it with the kind of patience people never expect from small red lights under workshop eaves. I was in the kitchen pouring coffee when my phone buzzed with a motion alert from the backyard camera. The preview showed Brenda standing on her patio in a pale robe, hair clipped back, laundry basket balanced against one hip, staring at the blue-gray fence like she was looking at a challenge instead of a maintenance project. The sunrise had barely cleared the roofs on Maple Glen Lane. dew still held on the grass. The warning signs were exactly where I had left them, bright and plain every 8 feet, fresh fence stain. Do not touch. Private property. The cedar still had that soft wet sheen that told any reasonable person to step back. Brenda looked left, looked right, then reached over and peeled one sign from the post nearest her gate. She folded it once, tucked it under her arm, and lifted a white sheet from the basket. I did not run outside. I did not shout through the window. I set my coffee down, opened the live camera feed on my phone, and started screen recording. The sheet went over the top rail first, heavy with wash water, sagging until the fabric pressed into the fresh stain. Then came 2 bath towels, then a white blouse on a hanger. The wind moved the fabric back and forth, gently, repeatedly, the way evidence sometimes writes itself without help. At first, nothing seemed to happen. Brenda adjusted a corner, looked toward my back door, and smiled like she had proved the fence still answered to her routine. Then the sheet darkened where it touched the cedar. A faint blue-gray shadow appeared along the fold. The bath towel picked up a line across its edge. The blouse brushed the top rail and came away with a pale storm-colored streak. Brenda did not notice until she lifted the first towel to smooth it. I heard her voice before I opened the door. No, 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 no. She pulled the sheet down, and the transfer showed in long, uneven bands exactly where the wet cotton had rested against the fresh boards. She spun toward my house, waving one blue-marked corner in the air. Ethan Caldwell, you did this on purpose. I stepped onto my porch with my phone already recording, my blue carpenter pencil tucked behind my ear, and the smell of curing stains still hanging over the yard. Brenda, the sign said not to touch the fence. You ruined my laundry. You placed it on my private fence after written notice. You coated it. I maintained it. She grabbed the folded sign from under her arm and held it up like it somehow helped her. These little signs do not give you the right to damage my property. I looked at the missing space on the post where that sign had been taped 24 hours earlier, then at the camera under my workshop eave blinking steadily above us. That sign was on my property before you removed it. Her face tightened. She looked from the camera to the stained sheet, then back to me, and I watched her make the same decision she had made for years. If the facts did not help her, she would raise the volume and call it authority. By 7:10, she had sent an emergency email to the Maple Glen board accusing me of maliciously contaminating a community-facing fence. By 7:20, she was on the phone with the sheriff's office claiming I had intentionally destroyed her belongings. By 7:30, Molly was at my kitchen island with her laptop open, pulling the clips into the timeline before Brenda's version could get comfortable. We laid out everything. Laura's notice, Glenn's finding, the stained product sheet, the posted sign photos, the video of the empty fence after maintenance, the sunrise footage of Brenda removing the sign, and the clip of her hanging wet laundry anyway. Outside, the blue-gray fence stood quiet in the morning light, beautiful, sealed, and finally telling the truth in a color no one could ignore. Deputy Ryan Cole arrived at 8:12, just as the sun had finished drying the dew from the grass, but not the blue-gray streaks from Brenda's laundry. His patrol car rolled slowly down Maple Glen Lane, past the walking path, past Brenda's perfect front shrubs, and stopped at the curb where he could see both yards without stepping into anyone's story too quickly. Brenda met him. First, of course. She crossed her patio with the stained sheet bundled in both hands, holding it out like courtroom evidence, her voice carrying over the fence before he even reached the gate. Officer, he deliberately coated a shared fence with permanent dye to damage my belongings. I stood on my side with Molly beside me, my phone in one hand, the fence folder in the other, and my father's blue carpenter pencil tucked behind my ear like a reminder to stay measured. Deputy Cole looked at the sheet, then at the warning signs still taped along the fence, then at the one empty patch of cedar where Brenda had removed a sign. Is anyone hurt? He asked. No, Brenda said sharply, as if that question missed the point. My property is ruined. Then let us slow down, he said. I liked him immediately for that. People who slow things down are harder to mislead. I opened my gate and invited him into my yard. Brenda tried to follow, but he held up one hand politely. Ma'am, please stay on your side for now unless Mr. Caldwell gives permission. The look on her face told me that sentence offended her more than the stained laundry. On the patio table, Molly had already arranged the timeline in order. County finding, attorney notice, certified delivery receipt, product label, photos of the posted signs, video of the empty fence after staining, and the sunrise clip. Deputy Cole watched the first video without expression. There was my fence, freshly stained, empty, marked every 8 feet. Then the second clip showed Brenda stepping into frame, laundry basket on her hip, reading the sign, peeling it from the post, folding it, and hanging the white sheet directly over the wet top rail. The whole yard went quiet except for a sprinkler ticking 2 houses down. Deputy Cole replayed the part where she removed the sign. Then he looked over the fence at Brenda. Why were your sheets on his private fence after written notice? Brenda's mouth opened, closed, and opened again. Because the fence faces the lane. It has always been used as part of the shared visual boundary. Deputy Cole glanced at Glenn Harris's county finding. This says it is permitted private property. That is a technicality. No, ma'am, he said, not unkindly. That is the location of the property. Molly lowered her eyes to her laptop so Brenda would not see her smile. I did not smile. I was watching the fence, the color drying deeper into the cedar, the watermarks disappearing under a finish I had every right to apply. Brenda shifted tactics. He knew I used that fence. I knew you had been told not to, I said. I knew you received the attorney notice. I knew signs were posted. I knew the fence was empty when I stained it. Deputy Cole asked for copies of everything, and Molly handed him a flash drive while I gave him printed records. Brenda kept talking about intent, community expectations, and malicious color choice, but the more she spoke, the more the evidence did the opposite. It made the morning smaller and simpler. A homeowner maintained his fence. A neighbor ignored written notice. A sign was removed. Wet laundry was hung where it did not belong. Before Deputy Cole left, he gave Brenda a calm warning that any further contact with the fence could become a trespass issue and advised both sides to let attorneys handle the rest. Brenda stood frozen with the blue-streaked sheet in her arms, no longer waving it, because now it looked less like proof against me and more like a receipt she had printed herself. By noon, Brenda had changed her story 3 times, which was how I knew the footage had cornered her harder than the blue-gray stain ever could. First, she told the board I had sabotaged her laundry. Then she said the fence had always been a shared boundary feature. By 2 o'clock, her email to Maple Glen residents called the whole thing an unfortunate escalation caused by one homeowner's aggressive maintenance choices. Aggressive maintenance. I read those words at my workshop bench while a set of cabinet doors dried on racks behind me. The smell of varnish mixing with the faint cedar scent still coming through the open window. Molly sat across from me with her laptop, adding Brenda's newest message to the timeline. She is trying to make the color the issue, she said. Then we keep the fence the issue, I answered. Laura Price agreed. By 4:30, she sent a formal demand to Brenda, the Maple Glen board, and the property management company. Withdraw the violation language, acknowledge the fence as private property, reimburse maintenance and legal costs, stop all contact with the fence, preserve all communications, and schedule a board review open to affected residents. Brenda refused the open review. That was her next mistake. Mrs. Evelyn Moore forwarded us the board notice less than an hour later. Emergency Community Harmony Session, Clubhouse, 7 o'clock. I arrived with Molly at 6:55, carrying the fence folder, my father's blue carpenter pencil, and a calm I had not felt in years. The Maple Glen Clubhouse smelled like carpet cleaner, burnt coffee, and the lemon cookies someone always brought to meetings where people pretended rules were friendship. Folding chairs were packed tight. Brenda sat at the front table in a navy blazer, pearl earrings, and a white blouse that made the blue-streaked sheet folded beside her look even louder. She had placed it there like evidence. Laura placed our projector on the table and smiled politely. Thank you for preserving the item, she said. Brenda's face tightened. The meeting started with Brenda saying the association needed to address hostile actions affecting shared visual harmony. Laura stood before the phrase could settle. Let us begin with ownership. The first slide was Glenn Harris's county finding. Permitted private fence. Properly placed. Not a common element. Not an association facility. Then came the survey. Then the fence permit. Then the certified notice. Then the product label for the blue-gray exterior wood stain. The room stayed quiet, but it was not Brenda's kind of quiet. It was listening quiet. Laura played the maintenance video next. Empty fence, posted signs every 8 feet, fresh stain visible, no laundry, no contact. Then she played the sunrise clip. Brenda entered the frame with the basket. Brenda read the sign. Brenda removed the sign. Brenda hung the white sheet over the wet rail. The clubhouse air changed. A man near the back whispered. She took the sign down. Mrs. Evelyn Moore said, not loudly but clearly, she was warned. Brenda leaned toward her microphone. The color choice was clearly punitive. Laura clicked to the timeline. 43 incidents appeared in rows. Dates, photos, wet fabric, damage, warnings, responses. The room saw years become one page. Laura pointed at the earliest photo, then the latest. The maintenance was scheduled after repeated unauthorized use and written notice. The damage happened because the laundry was placed on private property after warnings were removed. Deputy Cole's written incident summary appeared last, with one sentence highlighted. Complainant placed items on private fence after posted notice. Brenda reached for the blue-streaked sheet, but this time it did not look like proof of my wrongdoing. It looked like the final page of her own instruction manual. I set my father's blue carpenter pencil on the table beside the folder and looked at the board. That fence was built to mark a line, I said. I spent years asking her to respect it. All I did was make the line harder to ignore. The board did not vote that night, not officially, because Brenda tried to stop the room from becoming a record before the truth finished spreading through it. She said the matter required executive review. She said the association needed legal guidance. She said emotions were high and community harmony would be better served by patience. But for the first time since I had lived on Maple Glen Lane, people did not accept her soft phrases as instructions. A man named Peter Hall stood up with his phone in his hand and asked why the president had sent residents an email calling my fence shared when the county records said private. A young mother near the coffee table asked whether her children were allowed to lean bikes against anyone's fence if it faced the walking lane. Mrs. Evelyn Moore lifted her hand and said she had seen Brenda remove my private fence tag months earlier. Every question made Brenda's blue-streaked sheet look less like evidence and more like a confession folded on the table. Laura did not rush the silence. She let residents look at the timeline, the permit, the sign removal video, and Deputy Cole's summary until the pattern was simple enough for anybody to carry home. Then she placed one final document on the projector, Maple Glen Enforcement Guidelines. The section Brenda herself had quoted for years said no resident may attach, hang, store, or display personal items on another owner's structure without written permission. A laugh moved through the room, quiet and bitter, because everybody recognized her favorite kind of rule only after it pointed back at her. Brenda reached for the microphone. That provision refers to permanent displays. Laura clicked to a board email Brenda had sent 2 years earlier fining a resident for leaving a damp pool towel on a neighbor's railing after a community swim day. The highlighted line read, "Temporary placement still constitutes unauthorized use of private structure." Molly looked down at her laptop, but I saw her smile. Brenda stared at the screen, and for the first time all evening, she had no softer word ready. The property manager cleared his throat and asked for a recess. Laura shook her head. Before any recess, my client needs confirmation that no further violation letters will be issued based on the lawful maintenance of his private fence. The room turned toward the board table. One by one, the other board members looked at the documents instead of Brenda. That was the shift. Not dramatic, not loud, just a group of people realizing the president had used the association seal to defend her own habit. Brenda finally said, "I never intended this to become personal." I looked at the photographs on the screen, towels dripping into my tomatoes, wet sheets bending the top rail, the missing brass tag, the sign peeled off at sunrise, the blue-gray streaks she had made herself. It became personal the first time you decided my no did not count. Mrs. Moore nodded, and then others did too. The board voted to table Brenda's complaint, withdraw the hostile maintenance language from the community email, and send the matter to independent counsel with all records preserved. It was not full justice yet, but it was the first time Maple Glen had put a limit around her voice. Outside after the meeting, the air smelled like cut grass and summer rain. Brenda walked past me carrying the blue-streaked sheet in a plastic bag, no longer waving it for witnesses. Her son Trevor was waiting near her car, and I heard him say, low but clear, "Mom, you knew that fence was his. I told you after the survey thing last year." Brenda snapped his name under her breath, but it was too late. Molly's recorder was still running in her hand, pointed down, catching only sound in the public parking lot. Trevor saw us, flushed, and added quieter. She said if she used it long enough, nobody would argue anymore. I did not answer. I did not need to. The blue fence had already spoken in pictures. Now her own family had given the habit a motive. Independent counsel finished the review 12 days later, and the result arrived in a packet so plain it almost felt gentle after years of Brenda's dramatic letters. Maple Glen withdrew every warning connected to my fence, corrected the community email, and acknowledged in writing that the cedar fence along my north yard was private property, permitted, properly placed, and not available for resident use without my written permission. The association reimbursed my legal fees, the county documentation costs, the extra maintenance expense, the replacement of the brass private fence tag Brenda had removed, and the resealing work for the boards damaged by repeated wet fabric. They also adopted a simple rule that should never have required a meeting. No officer, committee member, or resident could use another owner's fence, railing, gate, wall, or structure as a drying line, display area, storage point, or shared visual feature without written consent from the owner. Brenda was removed from the enforcement committee first, then stepped down as president after the board received Trevor's written statement and Mrs. Evelyn Moore's signed witness note. The announcement called it a leadership transition, which made Molly laugh so hard she nearly spilled coffee on the timeline folder. I did not laugh. Not because I felt sorry for Brenda, but because I had learned how expensive small disrespect becomes when everyone lets it stay small. The blue-gray fence dried into a beautiful color, deeper in the shade and softer in the sun, like storm clouds settling over cedar. The old watermarks disappeared under the stain. The raised grain stopped catching my hand when I walked past it, and the tomato bed finally stopped smelling faintly of someone else's detergent after rain. I installed the new brass tag near the gate on a Saturday morning while the neighborhood was quiet. Private fence. Respect the line. For words, 2 screws, 1 boundary nobody had to interpret. My father's blue carpenter pencil sat on the top rail while I worked, and for a moment the color of the pencil, the color of the fence, and the little blue marks in my old repair notes all lined up in a way that felt less like revenge and more like closure. Brenda did not speak to me for weeks. She took down the line she had strung across her patio and finally bought a folding drying rack from the hardware store on County Road 6. I knew because I saw the box on her porch, and because for the first time in years, Monday morning came without lavender sheets hanging over my cedar. Mrs. Moore stopped by that afternoon with another lemon cake and stood beside the fence, tilting her head like she was looking at a painting. "It suits the yard," she said. "It also suits the lesson." I looked at the workshop camera above the eave, the one that had blinked through every towel, every sheet, every excuse, and every final blue streak. The camera was just plastic and wire, but it had done what patience alone could not. It had made routine visible. It had turned a bad habit into a record. That evening, I cleaned my cabinet bench, swept cedar dust into a small pile, and dropped my father's blue pencil back into the chipped ceramic cup beside my measuring tape. Outside, the fence caught the last light over Maple Glen Lane, calm and solid and completely mine. Brenda had spent years acting like a boundary was only real if she agreed with it. But wood remembers. Cameras remember. Paper remembers. And sometimes justice does not arrive with noise at all. Sometimes it dries blue in the sun, right where the line was always drawn.